Hi. Manuel Álvarez Bravo was considered to be the leading figure of Latin American photography in the 20th century. He lived for 100 years and took photographs during 8 decades. Within that time, he played a significant role in the development of modern photography. Aptly, he received the titles of Don Manuel and El Maestro. Curators have labeled him a surrealist and a symbolist. They called his work Freudian, Marxist, and patriotic. He never actually disagreed. All he said was that they just might be right. He didn't work from the intellect. He relied on the will to rise up within him, to explore something and then react through impulse. Later in life, when he taught, he told his students, "Shoot what you see, not what you think." In my opinion, his major contribution to photography was his ability to absorb the photographic advances from Europe and North America and meld them with the distinctive Latin American way of seeing the world. Mexico was always an integral part of his photographs, but they are also poetic and managed to transcend culture, time, and place.
They say that the camera never lies, but it can stretch the...
Álvarez Bravo was born in downtown Mexico City in 1902. After his father died when he was 12 years old, he had to leave school in order to contribute to the family's finances. He worked at a textile factory for a time and then for 16 years as an accountant at the National General Treasury. He actually studied part-time in order to get accounting skills. Both his grandfather and his father were amateur photographers, so he was exposed to the medium from a young age. He was also drawn to the arts in general and enrolled in evening classes to explore painting, sculpture, literature, and music. And you can see later on in this video how this education permeated into his work. One can't separate the evolution of his photography from the events that were occurring in the country at the time. Prior to 1910, the country was ruled by a dictator, and there were a few really rich families that controlled the wealth and finances of the nation. The Mexican Revolution helped to broaden the economy and uplift the middle class. And his work can be understood within the context of him responding to this post-revolutionary Mexico. It was a unique period in which the government, academics, and artists were all united in their desire to redefine the country's authentic identity. From the outset, his work championed the country's traditions and culture. And he was particularly interested in documenting the fast-vanishing way of life of the indigenous people. He was also determined to contribute to uplifting the lives of the working class. During his 20s, while he was working as a bureaucrat, he developed his skills as a photographer. But he hadn't yet defined his own photographic voice. At one stage, he moved with his new wife, Lola, to Oaxaca and found that the region was rich in traditional culture. He captured the peasants' way of life and began photographing in the villages surrounding the city. It was during this time that he started to integrate traditional documentary approaches with his lyrical, poetic eye. By the 1930s, though, he came into his own as a photographer, developing his own voice. This photograph reveals his understanding of art history. He's applying subtle techniques to integrate the shaft of light, very much like the master painters like Vermeer. It isn't just about technique, though. You get a sense of emotions like desire and longing. In this photograph of a peasant man, he's able to move past the ethnographic idea of photographing foreign people. This is an ethnographic picture taken in Mexico in the 19th century. It's emotionless and acts very much as a functional reference. You can imagine the caption in some early textbook saying something like, typical Mexican man. Here, Álvarez Bravo is not just documenting a culture in a neutral manner. There's a communication and understanding between the two men. You can see by the way the man's looking away that he's letting this man take part in the act of creating this image. He manages to transform a simple portrait into a symbol of the indigenous cultural heritage within the new Mexico. It's interesting how people from different cultures have varying responses to circumstances. In South Africa, the post-colonial and apartheid resistance writing was often barren and focused on the brutality. The documentary photography also erred on the side of the austere, while the writing and photography that emerged in South America was more often lyrical and whimsical. The Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, known for his books like 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera, explored magical realism, which integrates fiction and fantasy. His books still have a punch, but the storyline is cushioned by a superstitious and supernatural view of reality. And this gives them a surreal quality. Álvarez Bravo's photography is often interpreted as surrealistic because he portrays the material world in a strange and abstract way. Surreal photography, like that of Man Ray, is engaged with unconscious ideas and dreams and emotions. So you can see why the surrealists thought that Álvarez Bravo was one of them. But he probably drew more on the Latin American traditions of folklore and mystical symbolism. He and his fellow Mexican artist friend Frida Kahlo didn't want to be called surrealists. The label unfortunately didn't fall away because the followers of this movement insisted that in order to be a true surrealist, you have to believe that you aren't one. It's kind of academic gobbledygook. Álvarez Bravo was a small, shy man, and he was able to move around the streets of Mexico without attracting much attention. In this street shot of a child's coffin on top of a ladder, he's looking back at tradition when craftsmen handmade these coffins for children that died very young. The infant mortality rate was said to be around 75%. In this shot that includes a mural, he's looking at creeping modernization. The mural shows a woman's skirt and legs, and the building has new electric lights. His photographs were becoming layered with meaning, but they remain nostalgic for the traditional Mexican culture. There were some important figures who influenced his work, and Álvarez soaked up all of the ideas that he was exposed to and assimilated them into the development of his unique vision. He said that the scales fell from his eyes when he met and was mentored by a German photographer called Hugo Bremo, who had a studio in Mexico City. The German also encouraged him to buy his first camera. It was the Italian photographer Tino Medotti who introduced him to the avant-garde and European modernism, and he embraced these approaches and added them to his visual arsenal. He started moving away from pictorial realism. With the emergence of Cubism, he started to explore the possibilities offered by abstraction. Medotti was eventually deported because of her radical communist views, but she left him her camera and persuaded him to become a full-time photographer. He again adapted these new ideas, in this case modernism. For him it meant looking backwards at what was indigenous to Mexico. In this photograph called Absent Portrait, he's referencing the absence of woman, perhaps the loss of traditional feminine aspects within women. It could also include ideas of abandonment and loss. Even though he never met Edward Weston, he was strongly influenced by his work, especially Weston's boldness of form. Álvarez Bravo found Western's ideas too detached, and he wanted to integrate this aesthetic with an approach that incorporates the more intimate connections that one experiences during photograph taking. The time in which Weston and his assistant Modotti were in Mexico was very significant for Weston's own photographic development. He left pictorialism behind and made the move to what he called real photography. Álvarez Bravo and Paul Strand met in Mexico and developed a long friendship. This shot of Paul Strand's taken in Mexico shows his direct approach to portraiture. Álvarez Bravo's approach was always more gentle and personal. Henry Cartier-Bresson met Álvarez Bravo while he was in Mexico working on a film. In 1934, the two men had an exhibition at the Palace of the Arts in Mexico City. One interesting cultural variance emerges when you look at their individual responses to time. One could say that all photographs are about time, either its flow or its halting. But unlike the European focus on capturing time like Bresson's decisive moment, Álvarez Bravo often explored the idea of the lingering moment, how time can pass slowly, and within that space, one becomes aware of time's passing. During his last years, his eyesight started to fade, but he never stopped working. He photographed the large trees in the courtyard of his home and the shadows that they cast on the walls. It became a sort of combative ballet between the forces of light and darkness, also life and death. In his darkroom in Mexico City, right next to his enlarger, he kept a small piece of cardboard with the handwritten statement, "Hay tiempo," there is time. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.